Well, war has come at last to Latium. And guess what? We're doing it live! Okay, this is a meme that I actually do know the origin of, unlike the prophecy has been fulfilled meme. The we're doing it live meme comes if you've ever seen Bill O'Reilly, this clip of him on, I think it was called Inside Edition. And it's like his teleprompter breaks down or something, and he's extremely frustrated. And in a hilarious, profanity laced rant, he says, "Just ditch the teleprompter. We're doing it live." And that's what's happening today on this penultimate, second to last episode of our series on the Aeneid. This whole poem, this whole time, has been the poem of fate. If there's one theme that hangs over the entire thing, it's the destiny of Aeneas and how his individuality is going to relate to this grand thing that he has to do that's written in the stars. And now that war has finally broken out, remember it's been brewing, and we've been talking about the tension over the locals, between the locals and the new arrivals from Troy. And finally, the Rutulians are going to lead the Latins to war against the Trojans. That's what's happening now. And something very fascinating happens, something I had almost forgotten until I reviewed this part of the poem to talk about it with you guys on the show. Something kind of amazing, which is that the script, the part of the story that is scripted by fate, gets thrown aside, or we enter into this weird world where we're not totally sure whether the fated thing is actually going to happen. There are precedents for this in Homeric literature, in the Iliad especially. There are these moments when you think, well, we know what's going to happen to Achilles, the hero of that poem. We know that he's destined either to live a long but inglorious life or to go to war, win glory, and die young. But there are moments where he's doing battle even with the gods. It almost seems like he's going to break the bonds of fate. But it never gets quite so explicit as it does here. There is this moment where war breaks out, and we are kind of trucking along thinking, yes, this is part of the glorious story of how Rome was won and founded and created. And then suddenly it all seems to go off the rails. And obviously, Virgil, the author, is still in control. He's doing this knowingly, and we are kind of aware in the back of our minds that we can't really have a story that goes out of control because there is always an author. And yet, Virgil is doing something really creative and interesting by suggesting that there is an element of uncertainty when you're living through this story. And one of the things we've been tracking that really comes forward here is that in retrospect, when you're looking back on history, it all takes the shape of a neat story and narrative. And you can see the structure in things and even the divine plan in things. But when you're living through it, nothing seems planned. Everything seems uncertain. And you can't see the design from when you're down on the ground, when you're in it. And Virgil has always been giving us both of these perspectives. He's been giving us the in the moment perspective of Aeneas and his Trojan men. He's also been giving us the retrospective vision of Augustus and Virgil himself and the Romans as they enter into this age of empire. And now the confusion of that or the mystery of that is going to come right up to the front of the stage, because of course in a poem, in a work of art, the story functions kind of like fate, if you think of it that way, right? The fates have set this path for Aeneas to travel along, and Virgil is also writing a story that has been told before by other authors, and he's entering into a big canon of literature, including Homer and other Greek authors who have set the plot beats, the story beats of how this thing is supposed to go. And so now he kind of has that structure in place as if there were fate, right? That story structure becomes a kind of fate. And what's going to happen now is as we really get into the Iliad portion of the tale, that is the war part, where everyone has kind of a role to play. If you think about, well, Aeneas is the hero of this story, so he's going to be like Achilles, and then Turnus, the leader of the Rutulians, is going to be like Hector. Everyone is kind of assigned a particular role to play, and that's like their fate, right? That's how we know what's going to happen. But that's going to get scrambled in these really fascinating ways, so that we actually we wonder, well, did it have to go this way? Were there other alternative histories? Is there a kind of multiverse of paths not traveled? And is Rome's greatness really as fated as we've been led to believe? This is the perfect thing to encounter in the penultimate moment of the story, right? It's the thing that if you're a master storyteller, you might lead your audience along to expect one thing. And then right at the last moment, you might think, oh, maybe everything's going to twist and change and there's going to be something totally radically unexpected. And then it's even more satisfying when the other shoe drops and it turns out, yes, in fact, Rome is going to get founded, and this destiny that you thought was coming into shape, you didn't see. It seemed scrambled. It seemed like it couldn't possibly happen, and then it did, right? So today we're going to lead us right up to that cliffhanger moment when it looks like everything is about to fall apart. And so you may remember that when we left the story last time, war was brewing like a storm on the horizon, and we had the incredible Alecto, the Fury, who comes to dredge up all these old wounds and to stir up controversy and animosity. And she gets at Amata, the queen of the Latins, and makes her resentful about, or even just kind of pokes at her already existing resentments about the marriage of her daughter Lavinia, the princess, to Turnus. This is what she's been hoping for and expecting. And then Alecto comes in and says, hey, this Trojan is coming in and she's going to mess up all your plans. She also aggravates Turnus' own grievances at having expected this triumph to the end of his long and glorious career. And now what? This guy's just going to come in and take our land and interrupt our civilization. And so now really the only thing standing in the way of war is King Latinus, who is more sympathetic. He represents kind of the peaceful native, or the native that wants to collaborate with the new arrival and the newcomer. But Latinus is now outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched, and he's also weak. And we know this, right? He's an admirable character in many ways, a lovable character, but he is at the end of his strength. And so he's now sinking kind of into the role of the king of Rohan. If you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies or read the books, right, where this is the kind of king who has lost his way and been taken over by bad advisors, and he doesn't have the personal chutzpah, right, the resolve and the strength to stand alone and lead his country. And that's kind of, unfortunately, what happens to Latinus. He sees the storm clouds of war brewing, and he abdicates. He locks himself away in his palace and gives over the reins of control. So there is going to be a war now. Turnus and the Rutulians are going to have their day, and the trajectory of how this is going to go is set. We're not going to have the peaceful collaboration between the friendly Latins, and the contingent that wants to collaborate is going to lose, right? And instead, we're going to have this war breakout between Turnus and the Rutulians on the one side, and who on the other? Aeneas has his men, he has his Trojans, but the problem is that they are already severely depleted, right? They've been on this long journey. They've run a marathon, and now they're supposed to fight the battle of Marathon, if you want to use that metaphor, right? They've been on the Odyssey journey already for 6 books. They showed up. They were so hungry they had to eat their tables. Remember, all of this stuff happened, and now they're going to have to fight a whole war. They're going to have to live out a whole Iliad, and so we need to call in reinforcements here, right? We need more troops from somewhere now that Latinus, the most kind of promising ally that we had here, Latinus is now out of the picture, right? He's been neutralized. And so the next thing that happens is that the god of the Tiber, Tiberinus, visits Aeneas in a dream. and kind of gives him a little hint about where to go. We're going to talk more about this thread of the narrative next time when we close it out, because this is laying the groundwork for really the ultimate and final confrontation. But what Tiberinus tells Aeneas is to go and seek help from the Arcadians. And this is another portion of the myth that has already been told in other versions of the story. This was part of the available stock of mythology. There was this king, Evander. He was supposed to be the guy who had brought kind of Greek civilization to Italy. And his city, Pallantium, is on the site, the actual site of what will become Rome. This can get a bit confusing because remember, we've said before, Aeneas isn't actually going to found Rome. He's going to found Lavinium, which is then going to be the source from which Alba Longa is created. And then from Alba Longa, we're going to get the ultimate founders of Rome. And this is a kind of a long history that will happen after the end of the poem. But when Rome is ultimately founded, it's going to be in this place, which is currently Pallantium. And there's lots in this, because if Evander is kind of the guy that delivered Greek civilization to Italy, then Rome is the inheritor, not just of all the Trojan stuff, not just of the might of Asia and the best of what came out of the Iliad, but also the best of Greek culture. So this is clearly a signal from Virgil that he's kind of bringing the stars and the planets into alignment here, right? We are setting up the place that Rome is going to become. And so for now, it looks like everything is kind of going to plan, right? And that's why this is a dream with a prophecy in it, right? We're supposed to think that we're traveling nicely down the road of how this is all supposed to go. Aeneas heads to Pallantium to talk to Evander and to get support from his people who are at constant enmity with the Rutulians, right? They're enemies of the Rutulians, so they're likely allies, and they're going to supply the troops and the reinforcements. This does a number of things for Virgil. For one thing, it gets Aeneas out of the picture. And this is important because remember, we're in an Iliad, and one of the central features of the Iliad is that Aeneas, or rather Achilles, is the hero of the Iliad, and he's absent for most of the poem, or at least a lot of the poem. Achilles is angry about the insult to his honor, so he's left, and that causes all sorts of dysfunction in the Greek army, and the war itself kind of starts to go off the rails. So Virgil needs to get Aeneas out of the way, out of the picture, but he can't quite recreate the exact same conflict that caused the Iliad to kick off. So we do have a fight over a girl here, right? We have Lavinia in the same way that we had Briseis, the girl in the Iliad, but the details are very different. And this is a way to accomplish kind of this symbolic meeting between the Greek and the Trojan worlds to create what will become Rome, but also to make the setup for the war, and to make it so that Aeneas is gone when the war actually breaks out. Turnus and the Rutulians are going to attack the Trojans in the absence of Aeneas, which seems to them like a good strategic move. Also, at the same time, shifting the camera kind of away from the war sets us up for another major set piece, and that is the shield of Aeneas. Shields are kind of part of the equipment that you just have to have. A shield piece is like one of the famous elements of war epic in the Greek tradition, the most famous one being the shield of Achilles. And so if Achilles has a shield, Aeneas has got to have a shield. And the Achilles shield was made for him by none other than the god Hephaestus, the craftsman god. We did cover this if you want to go back and listen to the episodes about the Iliad. There was this very kind of famous scene where Thetis, the mother of Achilles, goes to Hephaestus and asks for this shield. And then we get what's called an ekphrasis, which is to say a digression, where there's a long, long description of the art that Hephaestus is kind of engraving onto the shield. And it is incredibly detailed, more detailed than we can possibly imagine. It's got motion going on. So it seems kind of magical. It's almost like there's a movie playing or something. And this work of art, which is often kind of how ekphrasis works, this work of art like comes to life and we enter into it. And there's depictions of the city at war and the city at peace. And in that version, in the Iliad version, the shield is very kind of general or abstract. The things being depicted are like archetypes. This is what cities are like when they are at peace, etc. They're not of pictures of any particular stories for the most part. We do get little details, but we don't get like named characters, for example. Not all ekphrasis is like this. Other examples, for example, the poem that Catullus writes, a Latin poet of the late Republic, writes a poem in which there's a long, long description of a bedspread, and there are named particular characters from myth. There's Ariadne and Theseus are there, and Bacchus, the god of wine. And that's the kind of thing that Virgil is going to do with Aeneas' shield. So he sets up all the analogous characters. The mother of the hero, who in this case is Venus, the goddess of love, and that's to say Aphrodite in the Greek tradition, goes to the smith god, the god of the forge, which is to say Vulcan, who is the Roman counterpart of Hephaestus. And this is extra spicy because in the tradition, Aphrodite and Hephaestus are married. They're in an unhappy marriage because Aphrodite is Aphrodite. And so who better to be in an open marriage than the goddess of love, right? She's, she's a free lover. She loves everybody. She's always sleeping around, right? These are things that Virgil has to kind of skate over in his decoration of Venus. He wants to elevate Venus to this position of kind of the great Roman mother, but it's in the background, right? Because Venus is going to be the divine ancestor of Augustus, and Augustus is a very kind of buttoned up moral guy, and he's doing this campaign of ethics, of social family ethics, and reclaiming this kind of moral Roman ideal. And so Virgil's Venus is a much more demure and elegant and noble figure than the Aphrodites that we've talked about from Apollonius of Rhodes and from the Iliad and the Odyssey, etc. But all of that is there and in the background as we have this encounter between Venus and Vulcan. And Venus makes the same ask of Vulcan that Thetis makes of Hephaestus, which is, can you please protect my baby, right? He's going into war. He needs armor. He needs defense. He needs protection. And this sets us up for the shield of Achilles, which is going to make him as great a hero as the heroes of old. Remember that this whole time, right, Aeneas is now rising from his origin point at this kind of low, uncertain dejection that he was suffering when we met him, up to the stature of the kind of epic hero who can fill the destiny that has been laid out for him. And so this shield is kind of like an important component. In fact, you might even say this is the crowning object that is going to really put the seal on him as the hero who's ready to take that step. And fittingly, therefore, the things that are etched onto this shield are not just general depictions of how cities work or kind of allegories for the way that justice is carried out in a city. They are very specific elements from Rome's history. And once again, this is Virgil doing his signature move where history kind of becomes prophecy. If you've been watching the Apple TV adaptation of Foundation, or if you've read Isaac Asimov's original books, the Foundation series, they have this thing in it called psychohistory, which is where math is used to predict how things are going to shake out down the line. And it's this very interesting, actually, engagement with some of the same themes that we've been touching on here. Is there free will? Do our choices contribute to a design? Is the design emergent from our choices? That's all kind of part of the Foundation series. And this psychohistory thing is actually kind of a riff on something that Virgil, if he didn't invent it, he certainly introduced it in a big way to the center of the Western canon, and that is future history. Something we now think about all the time, right? How are future historians going to view our moment? How will they look back on our moment? And we have this awareness that our current present will look very, very different as part of a story that comes up in the future, right? That's future history. And what Virgil does in this poem is basically make history into prophecy, make the history into the future, so that he can give us this double vision of how things look as they're going on, and also how things will come to look in retrospect once the grand project of Rome has reached its consummation in the Augustan age. So once again, still on track here, right? This shield really is in some ways the embodiment of everything that Virgil is doing with Roman history. And we have a similar thing, of course, we've already talked about a similar thing from book 6, when we met Anchises in the underworld, and he made this whole prophecy, and he showed all the souls of future Romans that were going up to become glorious and great. And we had Marcellus, the kind of abortive heir, the heir that it seemed like Augustus maybe wanted, but who died of illness before he could be crowned. And we have all of these like alternative possibilities and the reality of what's going to come. But at that moment, Aeneas was really a spectator, right? He was being still led by his father. And we said at that point that that was kind of the turning point for him to now start to take up his own mantle. Well, this shield is that moment, right? Because at the end of this shield, Aeneas is going to take the depiction of all the future of Rome, which is the history of Rome up to Augustus, and he's going to hoist it onto his shoulders, which could not be a more obvious on the nose, big red flashing lights, right? Here goes Aeneas carrying the future of Rome on his shoulders. So that's the message that we're getting here. And I do want to read to you just a portion of the shield description, the ekphrasis itself, because it's amazing. And also because sometimes these parts of the poem, if you're reading along at home, you might be tempted to kind of glaze over, and there's kind of a lot of detail. And this is also true in general in war epic. There's a lot of stuff like the catalog of different people that are fighting, and it can get very confusing. But I want to just pick out one detail and kind of show you how this thing works. Near the very end of the shield, we get, surprise, surprise, the appearance of Augustus himself. So remember that Augustus has been very much a presence. This is not the first time that we've been aware that he is in the future. But here we get Augustus at war. And so not only is Aeneas becoming Achilles, taking on the role, the mantle of the epic war hero, he's also becoming Augustus. And he's taking on the mantle of the forefather of Rome, right? So this is, we've had kind of future history before. Now we have epic past, founding past, or present in the story, right? And future, kind of all converging, planets aligning, right? Like full occlusion, total solar eclipse, like sudden sign that this is what's going on. And we're really, in some ways, laying it on thick here, analogizing the war between the Rutulians and the Trojans to the civil war that finally brought the empire into being. And what we're seeing here is the Battle of Actium. If you have listened to this podcast for some time, you might know about the Battle of Actium. In 31 BC, Augustus fights against the forces of Mark Antony, and this is the end of 100 years of civil war that include Caesar and his dictatorship, but also many other attempted efforts to gain control of Rome. The Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus kind of start the whole thing. Marius and Sulla, we've covered some of this before. This is the end, right? This is the decisive final boss battle. And what Virgil is telling us here, among other things, is that final boss battle is kind of prefigured in all of these other epic fights, in particular this war for the territory of what will become Rome, this war between the Trojans and the Rutulians. So he's both saying, I'm going to depict the grandeur of Augustus' victory, and also Augustus' victory was kind of preordained, written into the history of this place from the very start, because it was prefigured or embodied by the fight between Aeneas and Turnus. So, as always, I'm translating here my own original translation, and we are in the Alexandrine meter. And I just want to read to you some of this battle array between Augustus and Antony at the Battle of Actium, and we'll talk a little bit about what it means and why it's important. On one side stood Augustus, leading Italy, right there, right, leading Italy, Augustus was contending for the leadership of Italy, and he did have Roman forces on his side, but this is basically like presenting the war as if it were preordained and as if he were the kind of rightful heir to all that Aeneas is about to win. On one side stood Augustus, leading Italy, the people and the heads of state, the mighty gods and household gods, and Caesar led them all to war astride his ship on high. Caesar, remember, is a title that has now just been established after Julius Caesar. It's passing on down now to Augustus. And so Virgil, one thing Virgil does, we've talked before about figures of speech, right, and ways of arranging words in this line, hinc Augustus agens Italos in proelia Caesar. You might hear Augustus is at the beginning of the line, and we wait until the very end to define him as Caesar. He is Caesar, right? That's you might think of that as hyperbaton, right? That this is like a long, you have to step over many, many words before you get to Caesar. On one side stood Augustus leading Italy, the people and the heads of state, the mighty gods and household gods, and Caesar led them all to war astride his ship on high. This was a naval battle, the Battle of Actium. From both his temples, flames gushed forth, and on his happy brow, his father's star. So the fated, right, symbols of heaven displaying that this guy is destined to rule. Elsewhere, Agrippa, favored by the winds and gods, towers at the head of his battalion, marked around the temples with a splendid naval crown. But now, dun, 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 cue music change, right? Scary menace is happening. What's about to come? And armed against them, savage in diversity, is Antony, the conqueror of eastern lands, who brings his forces from their ruddy, dawn-streaked shores, from Egypt and the Orient and Bactria, and after him, disgraceful, his Egyptian wife. Boy, it doesn't get more dramatic. I mean, this is like this is like those 60s and 70s reenactments of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, right? The barge she sat in like a burnished throne, except here the focus is not on Cleopatra, but on Antony, the enemy that Octavian, the rival that Octavian had to defeat in order to become Caesar Augustus, even though Virgil is kind of presenting that as preordained here on the shield. It's almost like if you think of the shield as like this disc, and on top of it, there are like different harmonic layers, different future discs and past discs, and they're all getting compressed into this one central focal point. And the war that Aeneas is about to fight and the war that Augustus has fought are like being aligned over one another. There is so much that is juicy in this depiction of Mark Antony. It starts with the word barbarica, barbarian. It's an amazing word for Virgil to use here because, you may know, it just means anyone foreign, right? The barbarians, nowadays, when the barbarians are at the gate, it's not just any foreigner, but a particularly savage foreigner. And that connotation is definitely here. But originally, the word barbaros in Greek just means anyone other than the Greeks. And the word seems to originate from that idea because people who don't speak Greek sound like they're saying bar, 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 right? If you speak Greek and you're listening to any foreign language, it just sounds like gibberish. That's barbarian, anyone that doesn't speak Greek. And if you are following along closely at home, you may notice that the category anyone who doesn't speak Greek includes the Romans, right? So technically, from the original meaning of barbarian, the Romans are barbarians, right? Anyone that speaks Latin, these kind of rabble, these other foreign people, these uncultivated farmers, right? But that is not the picture that Virgil wants to draw of Rome at all. He's just shown us that Evander, the founder of Greek civilization in Italy, is going to be the ally of the Romans here. He's telling us that the Italians are the heirs, or rather the Romans are the heirs, to all that is good about Greece. And they're going to get rid of all that bad stuff, like the rhetoric and the lying and the stuff that was represented by Odysseus back in the day. Now we just have the good, virtuous Romans with the upgrade pack of all the best of Greece. And the symbol of this is that they, the Romans, get to call other people barbarians now, right? So if you think of the concept of barbarian as like defining the center of the world, right? The Greeks are the center, Greece is the center, everyone else is barbarians. Virgil is now very subtly moving the center of the world to Rome, right? Rome is the center of the world, and the other people, foreigners, are barbarians. Well, who are they? They are the East, the Easterners. So Antony led a force, this is true, a combined force of Eastern powers. And Cleopatra, his alliance, his relationship, his love affair with Cleopatra was part of assembling that force, right? And that's what's going on here. I've translated a little bit cheekily savage in diversity. Ope barbarica vari isque armis. This is a classic picture of the barbarian forces going back to the Persian Wars. That if the Greeks are these united kind of this coalition of Greek speaking peoples, they all speak the same language, they have all the same ideals, kind of, not really, but this is part of the military propaganda, right? Like, we are all speaking the same language, we are all one culture. Those people, the Persian Empire, the foreign empires, and before them, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, right? They're a rabble. They just gather, and this is also part of the biblical depiction, right? The Tower of Babel. They gather a bunch of different people, mercenaries from all of these different lands, and they're not united by a common purpose. They're united by the lash, right? It is the fear of the king that drives them on. And I've said that this is war propaganda because it is, but I don't want you to think from that it's therefore completely false, right? The thing about war propaganda is nowadays we think of it as purely disingenuous, but really it is a motivational tactic that can be used for good or ill and can relate differently to the truth depending on who's doing it. This really was part of the difference between the Greeks and the Persians in the Persian War, that the Persians had this massive multicultural empire, if you like, and it was not necessarily bound together by much other than the power of the king. And different kings did better and worse at kind of suturing these different cultures and communities together. But that's what Antony is depicted as doing here. He is basically now a Persian king with this rabble, this horde of different kinds of weapons and fighters, and all under him from Bactria and from Egypt, right, from the Orient, which is a Latin word meaning the place where the sun rises, and we have this dawn-streaked world, right? And then, of course, the pièce de résistance, right, the capstone to top it all off, his shameful Egyptian wife. We get this amazing interjection. I can't with Virgil right now. It's so good. Nephos, he puts this in like in the middle of a sentence, and following him, shameful Nephos, disgraceful, his Egyptian wife. It's a dig. It's pointed, of course, because Cleopatra was herself this figure of fascination and scandal, right? The queen of Egypt, the luxurious seductress, temptress, who, side note, by the way, like also had an affair with Julius Caesar, but we're not really talking about that right now. We're talking about Antony, who has allied with Cleopatra in order to do battle with Octavian. And it's doubly shameful because it's not just that he has an Egyptian wife. In other words, not just that his wife is Egyptian, it's that this is his Egyptian wife. And we have to specify because he had had a bunch of other marriages, including to Augustus' own elder sister, Octavia the Younger. She was already his fourth wife, right? Now, divorce in Roman society was much more common, and there were reasons for it besides the breakdown of the marriage, but still, right? This is a lot of wives. Some of them died, etc., etc. But Cleopatra was the one that really broke up his household, and this symbolizes the breakdown of relations between Antony and Octavian, who were always a little bit uneasy with each other, but who had previously been allied. So the really remarkable thing about the Battle of Actium is that it takes place in 31 BC, just over, or just 10 years before that happened. Antony and Octavian were allied. They fought together at the Battle of Philippi against the assassins of Caesar. So Brutus and his cohort, right, assassinated Julius Caesar. And in the wake of that, Antony and Octavian represented the kind of Caesarian forces against the partisans of the Republic, including Brutus, right, and all the assassins. Now, in the wake of that victory, of course, the question emerged, right? The dust settles, everyone looks around. Well, who's going to be in charge now? And so, very, very promptly after that, the relationship between Octavian and Antony broke down, and now they're on opposite sides of the war in Actium. And as part of that, you have the breakdown of relations between Octavian's sister Octavia and Mark Antony, which begin well, they arguably begin before this, but the first thing that happens is that he gets into this entanglement with Cleopatra. It's very scandalous, very shameful, and painful for Octavia. And ultimately, he divorces her. And so when Virgil is saying, "Oh, it's his Egyptian wife," right? That one word is not just; it's like a double kind of whammy. It's also besides the fact that he has, all these Eastern allies on top of that, he has broken faith. He's broken trust with all the good guys, who are Augustus and Octavia, etc., etc. This, by the way, is the Octavia whom we have met already. Octavia the Younger was the sister of Augustus, who was present at the reading of Book 6 when Virgil read portions of his unfinished epic to Augustus. Octavia was there, and she heard the mention of her son Marcellus' name, and she fainted. So this was the mother by another marriage, different marriage than Antony, but by another marriage she had given birth to Augustus' presumptive heir, and the death of that heir kind of shattered her and made her faint at the mention of his name. But she's been like homegirl's been through a lot, right? Like Octavia really has been suffering, including this abandonment by Antony. And this is part of why Antony appears here as this consummate villain. And of course, he was the guy that did have to be defeated for Augustus to take control. So many, many, many things going on here, right? And on top of all of that, this interjection nephos, right? Unspeakable, impious, right? Or impious, I suppose. The impious thing here is not just all the stuff that I've just talked about, but it's also meant to call up a faint whiff of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which is what Cleopatra was a part of. In fact, she was the last Ptolemy. She inherited this dynasty, which in turn was a Greek dynasty that had taken over Egypt in the wake of Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC. So this has been going on for a long time. These are Greeks who rule over Egypt, but part of their method, their strategy for gaining control was that they basically went native. And part of that was they took over an Egyptian custom of marrying within the family. Incest, right? Brothers and sisters getting married, that kind of thing. And so we are invoking here all of that as well in the climate of Augustan Rome, which is extremely puritanical, might be unkind both to Augustus and to the Puritans, but it's very locked down, right? Augustus is trying to get a rein on some of the sexual excess of Rome. And so to just even hint at the fact that this Cleopatra character, who is now allied to Mark Antony, is also part of a dynasty that practices incest, right, is a very deft and economical move on Virgil's part, right? He's doing many, many things here. And all of this is bound up, gathered up together in the last section of the book. This is book 8, by the way. So the last portion of this description is what Virgil says about Aeneas' reaction. And I'll just read a little small chunk of this last passage as well. These images on Vulcan's shield, a mother's gift, inspire awe and joy, despite his ignorance of what they show. He hoists them on his shoulder now, the fate and fame of his descendants yet unborn. This is not something that people quote as much anymore, but it used to be one of the most famous lines in the poem. It's terrific, right? He doesn't know what he's looking at. He is still living in the present, right? He can't see the future for all that it is and all that it will be, but it is there, right? It's all literally not set quite in stone, but set in metal, right? And he hoists it on his shoulders. And in that moment, right, if the planets have been aligning, this is like all 9 planets now kind of smashing together into into one connection. There are so many things being layered on top of one another here, right? There is not only past, present, and future. There's Homer, Virgil, and Augustus. There's Augustus, Achilles, and Aeneas. There's Asia, Africa, and Europe, which are kind of the three continents or centers of the world. Aeneas himself, this is not something we've noted before, but Aeneas cleverly has three different women in his life, wives or almost wives, from each continent. There's Creusa, his Trojan wife, so that's Asia. There's and in the east, there's Dido, his African almost wife, so that's Africa, and then there's Lavinia, right, his final home, right, his final love, and she's the European wife. So now, of course, he's reviewed all the different possibilities. He's in some ways taken in all the different possibilities and assimilated them into himself, and now it's all going to land here in Latium, and it's time to win the war, right? Okay, so far so good, right? This is the height of fate, right? This is the fortunes all coming to pass. You can hear almost the horn section of the orchestra swelling with excitement about this grand moment when everything is about to be fulfilled. And then the war breaks out. Again, remember in Aeneas' absence. And something goes horribly wrong. This part reminds me of a really silly metaphor, so bear with me. It reminds me of when you go to Disneyland or Universal Studios and you're lining up outside, say, the Back to the Future ride, or you're lining up at the Jurassic Park ride, right? And you wait for like forever and ever and ever because these parks are super crowded now. And then you get to the place where you're about to get in the car. And they usually have this little video that was filmed in like 1983 or something, and they've been playing it ever since. And they've contracted the stars of the movie to come and act out whatever the scenario is that the ride does, right? And I think the Jurassic Park one is really kind of the classic example of this genre, where it's like there's some conceit, some story about how the ride works, like you are being invited to tour our wonderful new nature preserve where all these dinosaurs live, right? This is Jurassic Park as it was intended to be. And that's the video starts that way. And then in the video, you hear something go wrong off camera, and the stars are like, oh no, wait, okay, stay inside the vehicle, everything's gonna be fine. And then suddenly, like, the camera like breaks and static comes across the screen, and then you get that like rainbow colored high pitched beep, and suddenly everything seems to have gone off the rails as part of the story, right? That's what happens here. That we're going along, we've got the shield, right? We've got the hero, we've got Augustus, we've got Rome, like, here we go, yeah, cheers and adulation, it's all happening. Turnus attacks. The Trojans are taken kind of unprepared because they don't yet have their allies and they don't yet have Aeneas, and he's doing a Gandalf, right? He's off getting reinforcements, and they're kind of left vulnerable to this attack. And there are a few kind of unsettling moments, including a famous episode with these two young men, Nisus and Euryalus, who are either lovers or friends, and actually there's some genuine interest and dispute over this. But basically, they reenact an episode from the Iliad in which they go in secret into the enemy camp, but they get discovered and killed, right? So they die in each other's arms. So suddenly it starts to look like things are taking a very bleak turn, a darker turn for the Trojans than you might have expected. Now that they're going to war, and we thought everything was kind of that their victory was assured, right? We thought that we knew that they were going to win. They have to win for like history to happen. So we expect for them to take over and for this trajectory to be made complete, when suddenly the gods convene a council. Classic scene. We've read other scenes like this before, especially in war epic, right? The gods look down and kind of bicker and gamble for who's going to win. But this council is like one of those videos from the ride. Red alert, not a drill, this is not supposed to happen, right? It wasn't supposed to go down like this. And this is the Bill O'Reilly, we're doing it live kind of moment. Zeus says, what's going on? Like, what? I did not give my rubber seal of approval, my stamp of approval to this situation. The time for fighting is like hundreds of years later. The Punic Wars will settle all of this, right? And we've talked a bunch about how Rome's wars with Carthage as a republic, as Rome is expanding and growing, they have this long series of wars with Carthage. He says, you're going to have your fill, you gods, you rival gods, Venus and Juno. You'll have your fill of the battle between Rome and Carthage. And this is off script. This is not part of the plan. And there are these amazing comparisons. So Venus makes this kind of prayer of supplication, and she talks to Zeus, and she's like, I don't even care about the empire anymore. Just save my little baby. Not even Aeneas. Aeneas can go wandering where he may. Save Ascanius, Aeneas' son. So this is an astonishing moment where Venus basically gives up. Like, she's kind of hysterical. And in the course of it, she makes this amazing comparison between the Rutulians and the Greeks from the Iliad. So this gets a little bit tangled up, right? If you think about like the felt board and the pins, suddenly the wires and the lines and the rope is getting crossed, right? Venus says, look, a Diomede, that is Diomedes, arises, right, against my Trojans. So up till now, we thought we were kind of tracking this, right? Like, the Trojans with Aeneas at their head are going to go and ally with Evander and the Arcadians and get the best of the Greek culture. So they're going to become the new Greeks in this new Iliad. And then the Rutulians are going to become the Trojans, which means they're going to get defeated, right? That seemed clear. Now, all of a sudden, the roles get reassigned. Everything is scrambled up. And it looks like the Trojans aren't the Greeks anymore in this Iliad. They're just the Trojans, which means they're going to get defeated again, right? That is not supposed to happen. And the gods themselves are kind of giving up, right? Juno then comes back and delivers once again kind of the anti-colonial perspective. This is like always her role is to say, look, it was, okay, so the war has been started now by Turnus and the Rutulians, but they didn't really start it because Aeneas started it, right? He attacked King Latinus as an enemy, which is a very tendentious description of what exactly has gone on. Remember, Latinus has abdicated, so this is like a pretty partisan description meant to aggravate and inflame the blame of the past upon the Trojans. And you can just imagine this council of the gods, which is supposed to be like a meeting of the Roman Senate, devolving into chaos, civil war, bickering, like the noise. Like you can imagine Zeus kind of having to like bang his gavel, right, to get order in the court. And of course, that is what happened to the Roman Senate, right, in the lead up to the civil war. So if the picture of Actium is the picture of like Augustus bringing order, suddenly now we're plunged into what happened before that, and we're getting a much rawer and less pretty picture of how Augustus took control. This is the devolution of the Senate, the collapse of order, right? Nobody knows who's in charge. Everyone is fighting. And just as Latinus abdicated at the beginning of this war, now Zeus, which is to say Jupiter, right, the king of the gods, is kind of going to abdicate too. This is a very bold move on Virgil's part. It's kind of undermining everything he's just been doing, right? All the stuff I just told you about, how great it's going to be when Augustus takes control, and it's going to be smooth, and the bad guys and the good guys are going to be clearly defined, right? Suddenly that has collapsed, and we don't quite know whether this is good or not, whether it's going to happen or not, right? And these are the kinds of moments that make people wonder, like, is Virgil up to something more than just praising Augustus, right? And I think, as always, the answer is yes and yes, right? He is praising Augustus, but he's also not letting us rest in the idea that Rome, like, absolutely couldn't have failed, right? there were moments where it seemed like everything was going to collapse. There were moments when the order did fall apart. There were alternative dark paths we could have gone down. I think also in this context about, right, like in Butler, Pennsylvania, when Donald Trump almost got shot, and people talk about, right, whatever you think about Donald Trump, the fact that he swiveled his head like one tiny angle away and the bullet missed and hit his ear instead of his brains, changed the course of history. And so this is the other side of it, right? It's the other side of, well, everything's faded and all the grand design is coming to fruition, past, present, future, all in one, right? The other side of that is, yeah, but if you turn your head just a little bit, it can all fall apart. And so we are thrown here into midair, cast in suspension by the king of the gods himself, who decides to put an end to this quarrel among the other gods, not by making a decision, but by not making a decision. Here's his speech, and I've translated this part for you as well. Accept then my pronouncements. Fix them in your minds. So it sounds like we're about to get a decree, right? But we're going to get the opposite of a decree. Accept then my pronouncements. Fix them in your minds. Since a truce between Italians and Trojans is ruled out, and your disputes are without end, that is, you gods, you just keep on fighting, you're in discordia, where fortune falls today, whoever's hopes are dashed, Rutulian or Trojan, I will draw no lines. If by the fate of Italy the camps besieged, or by the wandering and crooked signs of Troy, nor do I pardon the Rutulians. Let each receive the wages and the fortune of his works. There is one king of all, and that is Jupiter. The fates will find the way. And by the river Styx, the pitch that surges through his brother's dark abyss, he nodded with a nod that made Olympus shake. This is a very confusing speech, I have to say, because it has the shape of a decree without really saying anything. In fact, in that way, it's kind of the consummate politician's speech, right? It sounds like he's saying, like, here's my decision. And he seems to be invoking all of these dark arcane forces. And he's not exactly saying no one's in control. He's just saying, I'm not going to call this one, right? I'm not going to intervene. Let this war play out how it will. I'm still going to be king at the end of it. But also, as king, I'm not making any decisions. I'm letting fate take control, right? Now, you could read this many, many different ways, right? You could say, well, doesn't fate, don't we know what fate says, right? We know what Fortuna wants here. Fortuna has laid out the future of Rome. So why then is fate now being invited to basically flip a coin between the Rutulians and the Trojans? It looks very much to me here like Jupiter is a bit confused and out of his element. And so even the gods, right? Even the gods are letting this thing fall where it's going to fall. Now, I think that we are still supposed to believe it's all going to come out the way that it did come out. Because, of course, from Virgil's perspective, from our perspective, history did happen, right? So just like in the Iliad, we can't really change the ending here. But we are also being plunged into what it was like to live through it, where the ending didn't seem written. And now even the gods themselves, fate is kind of murky. He's swearing by the river Styx, which is the underworld, where everything kind of disintegrates, right? The great loosening of limbs is what happens down there. And the nod is like very authoritative, but the pronouncement is extremely opaque and strange. And so we are now being put, after having been told and shown the grand vision of the prophecy in the future, we are now being thrown right into the murk and the fray of the fight. And I think that's what Virgil wants to do here. He doesn't actually want to say, like, there's some way in which history can be rewritten. He just wants to say, you and I are not off the hook because we are going to live through history as if it were the present. And that's going to make us realize that our present is also not set in stone, at least from our perspective, right? What happens next is up to our choices, even if there's some future prophecy yet to come that we don't know, right? we are being thrown into the moment to live through the moment with Aeneas of not knowing how this battle is going to play out. And that is the cliffhanger that we're going to leave the story on before next week when we finish our series. I'm going to describe the ending of the poem next time, how this war shakes out. We'll go back to Evander and talk a little bit more about his relationship and the relationship of his son Pallas with Aeneas. And then we will close out this poem with the famous ending that has inspired debate and discussion for ever since it was written, basically. So I'm on tenterhooks. I almost can't bear to leave you on this cliffhanger that Virgil has created, but I'm going to control myself and do so and see you next time. But before I leave you, we have a couple last things to do. First of all, it figures. This is the ending segment where we always talk about different ways of using language. I talked earlier about hyperbaton, which is the kind of big separation between words, sometimes across lines. In this case, it was just within one line, right? This big distance between Augustus and Caesar. Now I want to talk about figura etymologica, which is just fun to say. And also it's something which we don't use, or perhaps we don't just talk about it as much in English as, say, simile, metaphor, etc. But it's a very common way of arranging words in the ancient world and in ancient languages. And it's called figura etymologica, etymological figure, because it's when you take a word and then you take another word that is etymologically related to it in some way, and you do wordplay with these two words. And I have tried to capture it in this translation. At the very end of Jupiter's pronouncement, we get adnuit et totum nutu tremefectit. He nodded with a nod that made Olympus shake, right? The verb to nod and the noun a nod are, of course, the same word, basically, in different grammatical forms. And this is something, a construction that you see a lot in ancient languages, especially because there are certain ways of speaking that we don't use in English that are grammatical in ancient languages. For example, in Greek, when when somebody is afraid, we often say that they feared a great fear, right? That the phobos, the fear, is repeated twice. We get this in the Bible, the New Testament. We get it elsewhere as well. And there are a lot of different examples of this, including, or even perhaps especially in Hebrew, where every word is basically a core root that can turn into a noun or a verb or an abstraction or a concrete idea, etc., etc. This is like all over the place in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, many times when people are given names in the Hebrew Bible, we have some kind of figura etymologica going on. So it's very confusing sometimes for people when they're reading along, and I get this question a lot, right? I'm reading the Old Testament, I'm reading the Hebrew Bible, and then I get to this passage where it's like, I shall call him Ishmael, for God has heard me. And in English, it's like, that doesn't make any sense, right? But if you read the Hebrew, right, the Hebrew word shema, to hear, is then being played on, right? Yishmael, God has heard me. That's literally what the word means. And so it's sort of like if you said, I will call him Herdrion, for God has heard me, right? There is this like echo going on in the sound of the words. The Tower of Babel story is full of these. If you read the Tower of Babel story in Hebrew, Babel itself is a play on the Hebrew word bala, to babble, or to confuse, right? To kind of scramble. But then also when the people say they're going to get bricks, they're going to take mortar and clay and bake bricks. The word for brick is a derivative of the word for bake. And so you have this like play on these two different words that are very, very difficult to capture in English, but that's figura etymologica. And we can do it, right? He nodded with a nod, right? Is an example of this. It sometimes happens in English, and probably happens more than we realize because we don't think about it as much. But it is one of the most versatile figures of speech. In other words, it can do all sorts of different things. Here, and this is often the case, here it is a word of emphasis, right? Adnuit et totum nutu tremefectit, right? He nodded with a nod, right? That made Olympus shake. To say this again gives it a kind of certainty and finality. But there are other uses of it. For example, in the Tower of Babel story, I think it's really there to kind of emphasize the monotony of the project, right? Let us brick the bricks and mortar the mortar, right? Is like this sort of working chant that is part of the depiction of the dystopia that's going on in that story. So there's many uses of it. It's a kind of word painting. It's a kind of emphasis. But at its heart, right, it's just a technique of wordplay and drawing connections between words that brings more meaning out of them. So that's figura etymologica, and that's it. Figures. Finally, a mailbag question from Matthew. Mailbag questions come to me on Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You can send me a DM there, and I hope you will become a subscriber. This is a place where I do a lot of writing, post a lot of extra stuff, other content. If you're interested in the kinds of things that I talk about, then I would really be grateful for your support, either paid or free. And you can be in the mailbag like Matthew, who has written, I really enjoy your writing. Well, thank you, Matthew, especially how you write about literature. Once upon a time, I was an English major, and writing about great books was a big part of my life. Now I'm an accountant with a wife and kids and all the responsibilities that come with those things. I still find time to read and write, but I don't think my writing is much better now than when I was a student. For someone who doesn't have a ton of time to dedicate to it, maybe 30 minutes a day tops, what would you suggest I do to become a better writer? Okay, I think this is a question that probably applies to many people. I know that I have, for example, listeners who have kids and are homeschooling their kids and are rediscovering their love of learning that way, but also finding that as parents with busy adult lives and maybe jobs, they don't have a lot of time. And of course, literature is such a gift and a blessing that there's many reasons to want to become a better writer, a better user of language, besides just being published, which you may also, Matthew, want to do. But one thing I always say is, like, to become an excellent writer, to become an excellent speaker, is really to become a sharper thinker. And this is the first thing that I'm going to say to answer your question, actually. I have an essay on rejoiceevermore.substack.com right now. It is about this. It's about why using AI to prompt or even draft your writing is cheating yourself out of the best of what writing can offer you. And the reason for that is that people have this idea that writing is just like, I have these brilliant ideas in my head, but but I don't have the words to express them. So all I need is to find the right words. Like, I need to pick out the right box to put these ideas into so that other people can have them and see how brilliant I am. So what's the problem if I just get ChatGPT to find the boxes for me, right? It knows all the boxes. It knows all the words. So if I describe to it vaguely kind of what I'm thinking, and I get my ideas down into ChatGPT, then it will write the essay for me. So what's wrong with that? Why doesn't that work? Well, that's not what writing is. The great historian, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, David McCullough, had an interview once where he said, "Writing is thinking. To write well is to think clearly. That's why it's so hard." And this is very true. Our thoughts, even when they don't yet have words attached to them, are already kind of an unformed proto-language. That is, the conscious experience you have of thinking is, whether it's an image or kind of a feeling or just a gesture that you can make, however you would express that, right? You are starting to draw the outline of an idea that would otherwise be inaccessible, right? And that's what a thought is. And so writing, or even just speaking, right, putting words to your thoughts, is really just sharpening the focus on that picture. And the process of coming up with words to express yourself is the process of honing in on just what the thought actually is. And so this idea that the thought is already brilliant, you already have this brilliant thought, and the word is just a vessel for it, that's not how that works. You don't have a brilliant thought yet. You have a half-formed thought. That's how we all operate, right? And one of the things that is very humbling about being a writer that I encounter and grapple with every day is that you sit down at the table and you've been walking around and you've been thinking, yes, I have these great ideas. I know this is going to be, I can't wait to write this essay. And then you're like, wait, I only have like 2 words really ready. And the gap between them needs to be bridged by all these logical connections, right? I have like two sentences that I know are going to be good now, and how am I going to get from point A to point B, right? And so forcing yourself to specify and choose the route that you take from point A to point B, that's writing. And there are a million different ways to chart that path, better and worse. And if you let ChatGPT or Grok do that, you're going to get the path of least resistance. You're going to get the bot's path, which is just the version that will be most conformable to the most commonplace sentiments on the internet. In which case, what's the point of doing it at all, right? So this is the next step, right? Is the ideal in writing is to say something that only you could say, right? To hone in on what it is about your perspective on the world that is distinctive, that you have to contribute to the conversation. And that might lead you to think that what you should do is try to be as original as you possibly can. But in all arts, that's actually a mistake. That's a very commonplace idea, but actually the opposite is true. When you really want to be original, what you must do is steep yourselves in the masters. Great painters, right, who want to paint in their own style, begin by copying the masters that they most admire. They sit with Rembrandt for hours and they try to reproduce, to understand how he got that line exactly that way. And so my first piece of concrete advice for you about writing, about getting better at writing, is that you need to read way more than you think you do. Reading is what shapes your mind and the subconscious kind of impulses that you have and the store of available techniques that you're familiar with and capable of executing is by reading widely and reading a lot of different writers. So maybe you have time besides these 30 minutes that you're devoting to writing when you can read, right? Maybe you can make that your entertainment instead of Netflix or whatever, right? Or maybe you're telling me I only have 30 minutes a day to devote to literary pursuits in general. If that's what you're saying, then my first piece of advice would be spend 3 weeks every month where that 30 minutes is just devoted to reading, not to writing, right? Those 30 minutes for 3 weeks out of every month should just be sitting in a quiet room with your phone on the other side of the room or turned off and your computer closed, and you are just reading a paper book by an author that you admire and would like to be able to imitate. Start with this, right? For 3 weeks, 30 minutes a day, I'm just reading, let's say C.S. Lewis, because I like his prose, right? Or, if you have other time to be doing that, fine. You can spend those 30 minutes writing every day. But if you don't have any other time to read, devote that time to reading. Reading is the most important thing. It should be the iceberg submerged underneath your writing. If your writing is the iceberg cap that you see above the ocean, your reading is the giant ice that supports it all underneath. And so then if you do that for 3 weeks, you should then spend 1 week trying to emulate the style of the writer that you've been learning. And gradually over time, as you do that, you will find that your own voice starts to emerge. And gradually over time, you can start to devote more of your month to writing and less to reading, but start by doing a lot, consuming a lot of pages. Just like if you were going to be a movie maker, I would say, watch classic movies, read classic books. Then, once you are in a place where you're ready to kind of write more regularly, the next thing you must do is choose an audience. And that might sound to you like I'm saying, think about where you want to publish this writing, but I'm not saying that actually at all. Your audience, your imaginary audience, could be your wife, right? It could be the 5 people in your book club, right? You could establish a group of people that want to read things to each other. Pick somebody that you are speaking to, because when you do that, the many, many different possibilities and ways that you could be writing and things that you could be writing about get narrowed down. Like everything else that's good in human life, writing is ultimately about relationship and service, right? How can I be of service to you, my ideal reader? Maybe that is a group of people. Maybe it's the readers of the Claremont Review of Books, let's say, right? Think about, who are those people? What do they want to hear? What have they already heard? What's going to be new for them, right? That will shape your writing. It's kind of like, if you think of Aristotle's causes, the audience, I've heard it said by a friend of mine, James Poulos, that the audience is the formal cause of the text, which is to say that it shapes the way that you present the ideas that you want to present. And also, in part, it shapes which ideas. So think about your ideal audience and then try to serve that audience, try to speak to that audience, because you will find that the best of what you have to offer will be drawn out of you that way. And the self-indulgent stuff and the stuff that's just there to please you will gradually get whittled and cut away. The next thing to do after that is to cut. Everything can be said in fewer words than you think you need, especially on paper. And when you're cutting, one thing you should do is you should read your work back to yourself aloud. Because if it doesn't sound good to the ear or the imaginary ear, it won't work eventually. Even if you love this particular word that you want to use, but it really just doesn't fit the rhythm of the sentence, you need to cut it, right? You need to cut things that don't sound good when read aloud. And the way you develop your ear for things that sound good when read aloud is by reading a lot of things. So I return now at the last to the beginning of my advice, which is read as much as possible. Okay, I hope that works, and I would love to know how it goes. I would love to know from other people if you have questions about the writing process. It's one of the things I love to nerd out about. But for now, I'm going to bid you farewell and invite you to rate, review, share, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, I would really appreciate that. It's just Young Heretics on YouTube. That would be great. But 5-star reviews, announcements to your group chat, tweets, all of that really helps. So does subscribing to rejoiceevermore.substack.com. If you're looking for really old episodes, you got to go to YouTube because they're starting to fall off of the Apple Podcast feed, which only offers 300 episodes at a time. But wherever you listen, please do rate, review, share, subscribe. Check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, and I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.